Visitors to Phnom Penh's Choeung Ek Monument in Cambodia will encounter a traditional stupa, a stout, tower-style sanctuary designed for Buddhist reflection and worship. From afar, this small structure looks like a picturesque spot for a photo. Step closer, however, and you'll encounter a chilling display of approximately 5,000 human skulls. Though 5,000 casualties is already shocking, it represents only a fraction of the immense tragedy buried within the infamous killing fields. The mastermind behind this devastation was Pol Pot, the ruthless commander of the Khmer Rouge who directed the Cambodian Genocide. Although his name is rarely grouped with infamous 20th-century tyrants like Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, or Mao, Pol Pot's atrocities were just as devastating on a proportional scale. Widely blamed for decimating nearly a quarter of his own nation's population during a brutal 4-year rule from 1975 to 1979. Pol Pot established a legacy of torture, terror, and mass execution that continues to scar the Cambodian psyche today, more than 4 decades after his atrocities ended. Brutality defined him. His ruthless drive to enforce a radical communist and agrarian order became legendary, and today, the mere mention of his name still strikes cold terror into the hearts of Cambodians. Consequently, when looking at one of history's most ruthless despots, guilty of the brutal elimination of more than 1 million of his own people, essential questions arise. Who was this individual? By what path did he ascend to rule? And what terrifying devastation did he inflict on the very public he was meant to guard? To begin with, the leader's actual name was not Pol Pot. He was born Saloth Sar in 1925 in Prek Spouth, a tiny Cambodian village within the Kampong Thom province. Raised in a large family, he was the 8th of 9 siblings. When Sar was born, Cambodia remained under the thumb of French colonialism, fostering a bitter animosity between the local population and their distant rulers in Paris. However, Sar likely remained untouched by these disruptions, given his upbringing in a wealthy, property-owning, agricultural family. Growing up on a 50-acre family rice estate, more than 10 times the typical holding back then, he enjoyed an incredibly privileged youth. How did a child of the wealthy elite transition from a life of luxury to slaughtering a quarter of his nation? Despising schoolwork, Saloth Sar was a source of constant concern for his parents. Though academics bored him, the youth found himself deeply drawn to the radical ideas of Cambodian communists, particularly those fighting to overthrow French colonial rule. Adopting the rebel moniker Pol Pot, abbreviated from the French politique potentielle, meaning potential politics, Saloth had finally discovered his life's true purpose in the political arena. Indeed, he chose to dedicate his entire focus to the rebel movement over his academic career. This ultimately led to failed exams and the cancellation of his government-funded scholarship. Re-entering Phnom Penh in 1953, he carried a mind brewing with perilous goals, yet his most dreadful schemes would remain dormant for decades to come. Coinciding with Pot's homecoming, Cambodia finally broke free from French colonial rule, winning its sovereignty after a popular uprising against European occupiers. A dangerous leadership void now gripped the nation, inviting various rival factions, including Pol Pot and his communist comrades, to vie for ultimate control. For the time being, Pol Pot quietly put his radical ambitions on hold to work as a schoolteacher, mirroring the path of another 20th-century Asian autocrat, Chairman Mao. During the years 1956 to 1963, he served as a teacher at a private academy in Phnom Penh, instructing students in French literature, history, and geography. Within this period, he also wed Khieu Ponneri, his first wife. Had Pol Pot chosen a quiet life dedicated to his classroom, Cambodia might have escaped unspeakable violence and tragedy. Regrettably, history took a far darker turn. Concurrently, Pot worked on strengthening Cambodia's Communist Party behind the scenes. He assumed the role of secretary in 1960, gradually molding its doctrine to align with his own distinct version of Marxist-Leninism. Cambodia's newly established royal government refused to tolerate this dissent, launching a fierce suppression of communist movements. Consequently, Pol Pot and his associates were forced to abandon Phnom Penh and seek safety deep in the jungle. In this camp, Pot embedded himself with the Viet Cong. This served as the prelude to uniting his fragmented followers into the Khmer Rouge guerrilla army, a rebel force determined to strip the nation's monarchy of its power. As Pot expanded his army and initiated his 1968 rebellion, it became obvious that his lack of scholarly ambition was entirely offset by an almost supernatural talent for charm and persuasion. A former Khmer Rouge member later recalled how Pol Pot instantly captivated new listeners. Those who attended his lectures departed feeling deeply inspired by his explanations and vision, eager to return. To his followers, he was like a father. In a manner echoing his contemporary, Nazi dictator Adolf Hitler, Pol Pot structured his faction much like a cult, a group whose flexible doctrine coalesced around a magnetic figurehead. In the end, it was the sheer instability of the late 1960s and early 1970s that cleared the path for Pol Pot's rise. By 1970, a devastating civil war erupted, pitting General Lon Nol's regime against the insurgent Khmer Rouge. With Prince Norodom Sihanouk out of the country on travel, General Nol executed a military coup, prompting the ousted prince to team up with the Khmer Rouge. Naturally, U.S. President Richard Nixon also had his hand in the scheme, mirroring so many of the era's tragedies. As a combined force of 70,000 American and South Vietnamese soldiers invaded Cambodia to clear out Viet Cong and North Vietnamese strongholds, President Nixon launched a devastating aerial campaign, unleashing 500,000 tons of munitions over the succeeding 4 years. The result was a catastrophic humanitarian crisis for everyone caught in the crossfire. Meanwhile, atrocities perpetrated by General Nol, South Vietnam, and the United States pushed more civilians toward the Khmer Rouge, rapidly multiplying the ranks of their forces. In the wake of devastating American airstrikes across Cambodia, Pol Pot established dominance over 75% of the country. Following a ruthless siege of constant bombardment and engineered famine that broke the capital's defenses, Khmer Rouge militants surged into Phnom Penh to seize total power. Cambodia fell under the control of Pol Pot on April 17, 1975. Although locals believed the conclusion of the civil war would finally bring peace, they were unaware that their darkest chapter was just beginning. After decades of meticulous plotting, Pol Pot finally possessed the authority to execute his vision. Similar to history's most notorious tyrants, he saw absolute control merely as a tool to engineer his ideal society. Tragically, anyone who failed to fit his rigid blueprint was doomed to a ruthless end. Pol Pot envisioned a return to Cambodia's origins, hoping to build a proud society composed solely of peasants and workers. In his eyes, the corrupt educated class, city dwellers, and white-collar professionals were the state's primary adversaries. Ultimately, it was the intellectual elite who paid the highest and most brutal price under his regime. Among Pol Pot's earliest radical moves was emptying Cambodia's cities, notably Phnom Penh, forcing millions from their homes and shattering countless lives. Educated elites, including physicians, attorneys, and public administrators, were sent to indoctrination centers, plundered of their belongings, and subjected to grueling manual labor in Cambodia's rural farms and rice fields. Any protest against the grueling labor meant being sent to the Khmer Rouge's notorious detention camps, where relentless torture forced compliance or resulted in death. A former high school, known as S-21, was repurposed into a brutal interrogation camp. Of the 18,000 prisoners documented within its walls, only 23 individuals ultimately survived. The sheer cruelty of Pol Pot's facilities required formalized interrogation handbooks. These official guides even documented past patterns, noting how staff members regularly relied too heavily on physical abuse. Still, we must use political maneuvering to ensure they always confess completely. Only after we have pressured them politically, cornering them until they admit guilt, will physical coercion actually yield results. For Pol Pot's subordinates, torture proved to be a highly effective tool. The regime enforced a degree of absolute tyranny that made the grim society of George Orwell's 1984 seem mild by comparison. Under Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge, a vast array of everyday items and activities were torrentially banned, including personal belongings, jewelry, paper currency, religious practices, gambling, and almost all books. Disobeying these prohibitions meant facing brutal torture, immediate execution, or both. Escaping execution by the Khmer Rouge was no guarantee of survival. Pol Pot's disastrous administration of the nation's resources triggered a devastating famine, leaving countless Cambodians to perish from sheer starvation. The victims' remains were discarded in communal pits across the infamous killing fields as the death toll climbed to unfathomable heights. Yet the sheer cruelty of Pol Pot's regime extended even further than these systematic executions, grueling tortures, and forced famines. He engaged in numerous cruel deeds that were both absurdly trivial and deeply sadistic. He rechristened the nation Democratic Kampuchea, even though democratic principles had absolutely no place under his regime. Rigid regulations governed intimacy, daily attire, and even personal vocabulary, creating a reality that closely mirrors the oppressive control of Orwell's famous dystopia. In one of their most absurd decrees, the regime forced farmers to reshape their rice paddies into grids to mimic the Khmer Rouge coat of arms. But despite these bizarre, almost comical mandates, Pol Pot remained an unimaginably brutal tyrant. With his leadership, the Khmer Rouge forcibly abducted children from their families, conscripting them into a compliant army. These young soldiers were coerced into executing the dictator's genocidal commands, knowing disobedience meant immediate death. People of all ages faced unspeakable cruelty under a single leader's distorted quest for an egalitarian state, where any voice of dissent was violently silenced. By 1979, a massive Vietnamese military push seized Phnom Penh, forcing the tyrannical leader and his Khmer Rouge insurgents back into the wilderness. Supported diplomatically by both Washington and Beijing, Pol Pot waged a guerrilla campaign from these jungles for another decade. Following a 1991 ceasefire, the faction completely disintegrated by the late 1990s. In 1997, a breakaway Khmer Rouge group detained Pol Pot under house arrest, where he eventually passed away from natural causes at age 72. Ready to explore more of history's most brutal dictators?